In this video, we'll take a look at class constructors, which tend to be fairly complicated because there are many different ways to do things in Dart. Remember, a constructor allows you to pass data into the class when an object is created, and can also allow you to run initialization logic that will only run once when the object is first created. In this first example, we're instantiating a rectangle object and then trying to access a property called rectArea that gives us the area of the rectangle. To pass the arguments into the class, we'll go ahead and add a couple of final variables here, and then in the constructor say this.width and this.height to connect the inputs to the actual instance variables themselves. That's simple enough, but what if we also want to calculate the area when the object is first created? The constructor works just like a function, so we can add braces after it to run some code like the calculation of the area by multiplying the width by the height. The one caveat here is that we need to use the late keyword on the area instance variable because it's not actually assigned until after we have the width and the height values. Another thing to point out here is that in the constructor, you can use the this keyword to reference an instance variable, although it's optional and you only need to do that if it has a name collision with something else. And one other little thing I'll point out here is that if you want to add additional arguments to the constructor that are optional, you can do that by declaring a nullable value, then add brackets around it when referencing it in the constructor. The rectangle class we just created uses positional arguments, but the vast majority of classes that you'll find in Dart and especially Flutter use named arguments. They tend to make your code a little more readable because they define exactly what each argument is doing. In the circle constructor, we can add named parameters by adding braces inside of the parentheses. And notice how when we do that, they implicitly already have a name, so we don't need to declare the instance variables up here at the top. By default, a named parameter will be optional, but you can use the required keyword if it is actually required to construct the object. If it's a non-nullable value, it'll either need to be required or be set with a default value. But if it's optional and nullable, then you can just add a question mark in front of the type. Another little detail I want to point out here is that I'm using the const keyword in front of the constructor. When doing so, this allows you to instantiate objects with the const keyword. It's ideal to use the const keyword when you can, but it's not too critical of a concern when you're first learning Dart. Now, the final thing I want to show you is named constructors. In some cases, a class may want to have multiple ways to construct an object. Notice how we're creating two different point objects here. One is using the fromMap constructor, and the other is using the fromList constructor. They're both creating the same object, but they're going about it with different inputs. In a class, you can define a named constructor by first referencing the class name, followed by a dot and the name of your constructor. The fromMap constructor takes a map as its input, and the fromList constructor takes a list as its input. You'll often see classes in Flutter that use named constructors because widgets might have multiple different ways they can be created.